All right, we're recording. A couple things before we get started. I want to point out, remind you to start thinking, if you haven't already, about your master and his emissary paper, which is scheduled to be due towards the end of the final week of classes. Let's see if we have the syllabus right here. There it is. So yeah, looks like week 15 we don't actually have classes. It's called study week. And currently I have the master and his emissary paper scheduled to be due at the end of week 15. And today is what is it? Today is the 29th. Yeah, 29th. So that's where we are. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, still about over a month before this paper will be due. But getting an early start will definitely help the quality of it. And I want to remind you that the paper topics have been available to you all semester long. They are in the syllabus right here. If you click on the link, which is in the syllabus is on Blackboard. The paper topics for the master and his emissary have been here all semester long. Take a look. You have 2 topics. Choose one of them to write about. And I'm happy to talk to you about your topic idea if you're not for sure if it's a good idea, or if you have several ideas and you want help choosing, I can help you choose a topic which I think is most conducive to getting a good grade. So keep that in your mind. That will be something that you'll be turning in week 15. Otherwise, the plan for today is just to finish, well, no, it's just to continue on with chapter 8 stuff on the motor system. I'm still a little bit sick, so I'm not going to go full blast through the rest of this chapter. I'm going to do basically the stuff today on parts of the frontal lobe and the motor cortex in general, and then we should be able to finish up chapter 8 next time. And I'll probably have some type of in-class assignment next time as well. So yeah, we've been talking about the basal ganglia, which is a somewhat subcortical structure right here. It's definitely it's down in the brain and it's towards the middle, though it's not the most down parts of the brain. So the lowest, the most inferior parts of the brain would be like the cerebellum and the midbrain brainstem areas, which are about right here. So these are the lowest parts. Right on top of those, though, right on top of the midbrain. So that's these little bumps right here are the superior and inferior colliculi, which are part of the midbrain. Right under that is the brainstem. So right on top of the midbrain is the basal ganglia, which has these structures that we've been talking about that are relevant to these 2 movement disorders, Parkinson's disease, which we've called hypo, and Huntington's disease, which we've called hyper. Hypo meaning like a reduction in movement, hyper meaning a lot of movement. And so let's see where we have that. Yeah, hyperkinesia, hypokinesia, those terms are defined right here, or they're spelled out right here. And they're also talked about in your textbook. But what's helpful about these diagrams right here, they're kind of complicated diagrams, but they kind of help to understand what these terms hypo and hyperkinesia refer to. So for Huntington's disease, it's hyperkinesia. And a key element of hyperkinesia is there's too many excitatory impulses reaching the cortex. And this causes the cortex to send too many excitatory impulses towards the body. And the body, of course, is the thing that does the moving. And so the body is kind of constantly receiving new excitatory messages. And so it will go from one behavior, one movement to the other, and it will kind of constantly be shifting from one movement to the other. With Parkinson's disease, on the other hand, hypokinesia, the excitatory input to the cortex is reduced compared to what it should be, reduced to typical. And this results in the amount of excitation being sent to the body being too low. And so this results in a movement disorder, because for an individual with Parkinson's, once they've kind of initiated some type of a movement, it's very difficult for them to stop that movement by replacing it with a new movement. For us, it's easy. I can move my hand and then move my neck, and then I can move my shoulders if I want. I can go from movement to movement to movement quite easy. But with an individual with Parkinson's disease, once they do a certain movement, that movement kind of continues on until then it's very difficult to stop that movement by replacing it with another movement. So once they started a movement, they can kind of continue doing that. But it's difficult for their cortex to send enough excitation to the body to initiate a new movement with a different part of the body. And that's because of this excitation from the cortex being sent to the body is too small. So Hypokinesia is a thin green line. Hyperkinesia is a very large, a thick green line right here. So we talked about set shifting, which was relative to basically this idea of hypokinesia, which I just talked about with respect to Parkinson's disease. So set shifting individuals with Parkinson's disease, they're pretty good at typing a sequence over and over again, IRM, IRM. You can see right here, that's the no shift condition. But when they have to shift, when they have to go IMR, then IRM, so they're switching from one pattern to the other, the amount of time it takes them to do that shift, they really have to think about it a lot to shift from IMR to IRM, which results in the reaction times for pressing IRM being very slow right here. So in general, individuals with Parkinson's disease are slower than controls, but they're particularly slow. They're particularly impaired in this shift condition because they're having to do one motor sequence. And then because of the hypokinesia, because of the small excitatory input from their brains to their body, it's very difficult for them to go to a new sequence of behaviors. It's very difficult for them to go to IMR and then to IRM because of the hypokinesia. It's hard for them to initiate a new sequence of actions, a new action. So this is all review. So this is where we left off. I don't think I have talked about this yet, but this is kind of an interesting model of how the basal ganglia contributes to Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease, and also how basal ganglia contributes to motor behavior in a person whose basal ganglia is perfectly intact. So it's the analogy here, and they call it, this is a computational model, but you can kind of think of it as a metaphorical model or a theoretical model as well. We won't go into its computational aspects in any detail, but you can kind of think metaphorically of the basal ganglia kind of being like a dam like this, and there's all these different streams that are headed towards the basal ganglia. And those different streams, as it says right here, represent possible motor behaviors. There's all these different potential things that your body can do. And what your basal ganglia does, at least in theory, according to this model, is it chooses one of those potential motor behaviors to perform. And then the so-called choosing can be thought of, once again, metaphorically, as kind of the water running over the dam from one of those streams. So this would be how your basal ganglia would pick a single motor behavior. And then the way you would stop a given motor behavior would be the excitation from one stream increases simultaneously, whereas the excitation from a different stream decreases. And so you can switch motor behaviors when another stream starts falling over the edge of the dam, and then the stream that had previously been falling over the edge, it stops going over the edge. So this has been, oftentimes the basal ganglia is thought of being involved with selection of motor behaviors. There are all these potential motor behaviors that you can perform, and at any given time, one of them is selected, and the basal ganglia is the part of the brain which does the selecting. And this model can be kind of useful for understanding or conceptualizing the differences between Huntington's and Parkinson's. And I have kind of the simple right here. I've added this to the slides. You can kind of think of Huntington's as like a flood. And so that there's, different streams are it's like too much water, and a different stream is constantly falling over the side of the dam with Huntington's disease. So you're always selecting a new motor behavior with Huntington's disease. With Parkinson's, on the other hand, the water level is too low. So once a single stream kind of makes it over the dam, it's very difficult for a new stream to make it over the dam. And so that one motor behavior is constantly selected in Parkinson's disease. And it's difficult for a new motor behavior to become selected in Parkinson's disease. So Huntington's disease, you're constantly selecting a new motor behavior all the time. With Parkinson's, on the other hand, you have one motor behavior which is selected, and it's difficult to unselect it. It's difficult to start a new motor behavior and inhibit the motor behavior that you had previously performed. So I think that's it with Huntington's and Parkinson's. And that was the basal ganglia. So here's kind of the brain regions that we'll be talking about going forward for the rest of the chapter, and some kind of explanations or theories as to what these different regions of the brain do. We just talked about basal ganglia. Selection is the main word that I think of when I think of what the basal ganglia does for motor behavior. It helps you select among potential motor behaviors, which is analogous or kind of similar to saying the initiation of different actions. I prefer the term selection. The book says selection and initiation. I prefer, once again, the term selection. We'll also talk about a lot of these other brain regions in some detail. Cerebellum, we're going to talk about in detail, not today. Primary motor cortex, I will be talking about today. We'll talk about the brainstem a little bit, but all I'm really going to say about the brainstem mostly is, it's located at the very bottom of the brain, right on top of the spine, and it basically helps send excitatory output out to the body. And we'll also talk about premotor cortex, which is in the frontal lobe, and the supplementary motor area, which is also in the frontal lobe. But we're going to start today talking about the primary motor cortex, which is also in the frontal lobe. So there's three: the basal ganglia, kind of subcortical, it's on top of the midbrain. The cerebellum is subcortical, it's right next to the brainstem. The brainstem is obviously subcortical. Primary motor cortex, premotor cortex, and supplementary motor area, these are all part of the frontal lobe. So the motor system has regions that are part of it in the frontal lobe and regions which are evolutionarily much older in the subcortical structures. Today, once again, we'll be focusing mostly on the primary motor cortex. So before we get into that, here's kind of an overview of where a lot of these different brain regions are. Once again, we've already talked about the basal ganglia, BG, which is right there. Motor cortex is right there, MC. And I want to point out, this is a brain regions. Anatomically, you've had to label this on test 1. Motor cortex is located anterior to the central sulcus. The central sulcus is this thing right here. Motor cortex is basically right in front of that, right anterior to the central sulcus. Somatosensory cortex, on the other hand, is posterior to the central sulcus. So we also talked about that region of the brain is right here. So this is primary touch cortex, which allows you, primary somatosensory, which allows you to feel things on your skin. That area is posterior to the central sulcus. In front of the central sulcus, anterior, is primary motor cortex, which is a region which is not known to be important with voluntary movements. When you just I want to move my hand, I want to move my shoulders or something like that. Voluntary movements, primary motor cortex is known to be important for those. PM stands for premotor, and then SMA stands for supplementary motor. So once again, these are all the three frontal lobe structures that we'll talk about. Basal ganglia is considered kind of subcortical, and then cerebellum is definitely subcortical. The brainstem is definitely subcortical, and then the spinal cord right here. Those are the different brain regions. And there's this kind of complex set of pathways that I'm actually not going to require you to know in any detail for test 2. But I do want you to understand, what the primary functions of these different brain regions. So here's some interesting things, though, and I did ask some quiz questions about this for the Chapter 8 quiz. And this is interesting because there are definite inside the body. Obviously, there are neural connections which allow neurons that allow us to move, and that the way they move is excitatory. Impulses are sent either directly from the brain to the motor parts of our muscles, or there'll be motor impulses from the brain that go to the spine, and then from the spine, impulses are sent to the hand, which can allow, to different parts of the body that allow us to move. So that's the motor pathway, but there's also a sensory pathway. And what's interesting is that different sets of nerves, different sets of neurons are involved with allowing us to move and allow us to also process sensory experience, feelings. When you touch something, you can feel it. And these are terms like the alpha motor neuron. This is basically a neuron which allows us to move. And you can see one right here. And then there's also a sensory neuron. And what's interesting about this, a sensory neuron would allow us to feel, whereas the motor neuron allows us to move. So they're kind of these two different functions, and they each kind of have a different, the sensory neuron enters the dorsal side of the spine right here. So this is the sensory neuron, and it's entering the dorsal or the back side of the spine. So when you're saying dorsal and you're talking about the spine, you're referring to basically the sensory neurons, the things that allow you to feel stuff on your fingers or on different parts of your body. That information is entering your spinal cord on the back side, which is what dorsal means. But then the commands to actually move a given part of the body, that information leaves your spine through the ventral side, meaning towards the front or towards the underside of the spine, so towards the front part of your body. And when it says underside, it's basically like, when it says underside, it's kind of, you have to imagine that evolutionarily way back in the day, human beings, our ancestors were actually, at least in theory, were walking on all four legs. So the underside would be, would be the part that's like down towards the ground. Obviously now we're upright, so our so-called undersides are actually in front. And so the motor responses, though, that travel from the spine to our effectors that allow us to actually perform movements, those leave the spine through the ventral side towards the front or towards the underside. The stretch reflex in particular is an interesting movement because it actually doesn't involve the brain at all. And so here's the thing, which at the doctor's office, the doctors have probably done this to you before. They'll hit you right there on that, I guess that's a tendon right there. And they'll kind of poke you right there. And if your leg's hanging right, it will cause your leg to do that little kicking motion. And what's interesting about this is this uses kind of this feedback or this loop that occurs among the sensory neurons and the alpha motor neurons. And they actually don't involve the brain, at least in theory. This movement of your leg only relies on this loop from the sensory neuron, which can detect that something has changed right here. It sends the signal to the spine, and then without needing to go to the brain, the motor neuron can become activated, which will cause your leg to kick out. And my understanding of this behavior is that kicking out of the leg is one, which is basically the purpose is to prevent you from falling over. That's what it is, supposed to stabilize you to prevent you from falling. And this involves the sensory information and a motor message, which are sent in this loop right here. And this is one particular behavior which doesn't involve the brain. Otherwise, in this chapter, we'll always be talking about things that involve the brain. Particularly, we'll talk for the rest of today about primary motor cortex. So some important terms here. We will be defining population vector, which is probably one of the more complicated concepts and terms in this chapter, population vector. And the idea, I'll help define this here over the next couple of slides, but basically in primary motor cortex, which once again, this is the regions in the frontal lobe, it's just anterior, just in front of the central sulcus, neurons in the motor cortex represent the direction of movement. And you can actually, if you're measuring with electrodes, all of the electrical activity of neurons in primary motor cortex, you can actually tell what direction an animal is moving just by kind of reading out the electrical activity of different neurons in the motor cortex. And then you can do this because this concept of population vector has been somewhat well studied, allowing us to measure motor cortex activity. And then even if we're not looking at the animal, we can just look at the neuronal responses. We can tell, oh, the animal is moving this way or the animal is moving this way. We can look at the brain's activity and make highly educated guesses as to the different motor behaviors that an animal or a human is engaging. And usually it's animals, because you don't do a lot of studies where you're sticking electrodes into human beings' heads. Motor cortex is also involved with planning motor behavior. So before you're actually doing a motor behavior, the primary motor cortex, there's evidence that's kind of anticipating that you are going to be doing a motor behavior in the near future. And as I've already said, the thing is probably most famous for is the execution of voluntary movements. So the main two that I think about when I think about motor cortex is definitely planning of motor behavior, like anticipating that you're going to be doing a motor behavior, and then the actual execution or the actual performance of a voluntary movement. So this is primary motor cortex. So here we're starting to work on helping you understand what a population vector is. In order to understand what a population vector is, first need to talk about this idea of a preferred direction. This preferred direction is the idea that in motor cortex, each neuron becomes most activated when the animal is performing a movement in a specific direction. And so here is a study which kind of shows, which is investigating or studying the preferred direction of just one neuron. So there's a lot going on in these figures right here, but in each of these dots represents action potentials, but all of the action potentials in these figures right here actually come from just one neuron. And so this is a study which is trying to figure out what is the preferred direction of this one neuron. And so the way they do that is they have the animal, in this case, it looks like a monkey, performing different directions of movement. And for instance, here in this top chart, and it says so, if you look in the notes portion, it kind of is restating some of the stuff that I'm saying right here. In this top one, the animal starts in the center like this, and then moves either like out away from its body, or will move to the right, or move to the left, or move towards its body. So move in that top one, move, it would be like, that would be a 90-degree movement. This would be 270, 0, 180. So those are, 306 degrees of possible movements the animal can perform. And then what they're doing over here is they're just measuring with action potentials. How many action potentials does this one neuron fire depending on the direction that the animal is moving? So these are the different directions that the animals can move. And then basically the preferred direction of this neuron is the direction that the neuron fires the most action potentials. And so you could see here, it would be 270 degrees, or in other words, when the animal is moving towards, when the behavior is moving towards the animal's body, like this, that would be the highest amount of action potential right there. And you can see it starts in the center and moves down, which basically means starts in the center but moves towards the animal's self. This particular neuron in motor cortex fires many action potentials. It's important to note, though, that there are a lot of action potentials fired by this same neuron, even when the animal is moving kind of this way. But please notice that even when I'm doing it like these diagonal motions, I'm still moving towards my body to some extent. And so the preferred direction is basically this one neuron, its preferred direction is anytime the animal is moving, doing something with its hands, which is moving those hands towards its own body. It fires a lot of action potential. So I would say the preferred direction of this neuron is towards the animal's own body. And you can see it here, same type of thing, except here, instead of the animal starting in the center and then moving to the peripheral, here the animal starts in different peripheral locations and then moves towards the center. But you still find the same thing. They're still measuring from the same neuron in motor cortex. But here we're like starting out there. So here I'd be starting at 90 degrees and then moving towards the center. Here I'm starting at 0 degrees, moving towards the center. Here I'm starting at 180 degrees, moving towards the center. Here I'm starting at 270 degrees and moving towards the center. And they want to see how many action potentials does this one neuron fire depending on these different directions of motion. And you can see here that the animal that this one neuron fires the most action potentials when the animal starts out here and then once again is moving towards the body. So this little tricky figures here because like the starting location of the movements is a little bit different. Sometimes the animal starts in the middle and moves towards the periphery. Sometimes the animal starts in the periphery and moves towards the middle. But the thing which is similar about these two figures, the finding which they find for both of these different manipulations, is that if for this particular neuron, it fires the most amount of action potentials when the animal is moving towards its own body. Like right here, it's moving towards its own body. You can see the down arrow. And then right here, it's moving towards its own body. And in both cases, it's firing the most action potentials when it's moving towards its own body. So the preferred direction would be like towards its own body. That's how I would describe it here. Which kind of takes us to this idea of a population vector. So let's see here, it looks like another neuron right here. And then just for practice, it's kind of good to be able to look. So once again, there's a lot of, each one of these dots represents an action potential of that neuron. And you have to look at which direction of motion does this neuron fire the most action potentials for. And it looks for this one to be around 180 degrees. That appears to be the direction of motion where there's the most action potential. right here. So this is a different neuron. It has a different preferred direction from the one that I showed you on the previous slide. This neuron appears to be about 180 degrees. And so that is graphed. There's two different neurons here. They call it cell 1 and cell 2. It looks like cell 2 right here, its preferred direction is about 180 degrees. And then there's another one, this green dotted one. It looks like its preferred direction is around 90 degrees. And so there's all these, there's many different neurons. Obviously, there's, many different neurons in primary motor cortex. And all of the neurons, they vary somewhat on their preferred direction. Some neurons fire a lot of action potentials when you're moving towards your body. Some neurons fire a lot of action potentials when you're moving away from your body. Some towards the left, some towards the right. All of the different potential movements are represented by the firing of action potentials by many different neurons simultaneously, which is helping us get closer to this idea of a population vector, which is shown right here. So a population vector can be thought of for an individual neuron. It has a preferred direction, and for that preferred direction, you can kind of think of it as a vector. With vector basically mean preferred direction and vector are basically terms which are synonyms. A population vector, on the other hand, though, is when you take all of the individual preferred directions or all of the individual vectors for each individual neuron in motor cortex, and you basically add them together. Or you could think of it as kind of averaging the activity of all of those different neurons. That's when you get a population vector. So I'm performing a movement, like moving like this. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of neurons in my motor cortex which become activated when I'm performing that. Not every single one of those neurons has a preferred direction, which is exactly moving towards my body. Some of them will have preferred directions that are this way. Some of them will have preferred directions that are this way. Some of them will have preferred directions to the left and to the right. The actual population vectors, if you take all of those neurons, if you kind of add up all of their action potentials, what you tend to find is that the behavior that you actually perform is basically like an average or the sum of all of those individual neuronal activities. And then that's what these dotted lines are right here. This is a population vector. Each of these individual lines right here is the vector or the preferred direction of an individual neuron. And when I am moving this way, my motor cortex represents it by all of these different preferred directions. If you add up all of these different lines right here, and you kind of take the average, then the direction tends to equal this direction right here, which is the direction I'm performing. If I'm doing a movement towards myself, each one, once again, each of these little reddish, orange, each brown lines, these represent different neurons with different preferred directions, that is different vectors. You add them all up when I'm performing a motor behavior, you take the average, and that's what the population vector is right here. And so if you are able to, if you know the preferred directions of many neurons in motor cortex, this is what I was saying at the beginning of this, when we were talking about this, if you know the preferred directions of many neurons in motor cortex, then you can measure all of their activity and you can look at which ones are most active and which ones are least active. You can add up all of the activity of all those different neurons and you could say, oh, it looks like this set of neurons is most active when this animal is performing this motor behavior. And if you're not looking at what the animal's doing, and then someone asks you, okay, so based on what you're seeing in these neuronal responses, which neurons are most active during this movement? What direction of movement is the animal performing? The idea of a population vector, which once again, adding up the activity of all of these different neurons, each with its own preferred direction. If you can use that population vector information, it allows you to know what direction of movement the animal is performing, even if you're not actually looking at the animal's movement itself. So this is the idea of population vector. And here's a kind of a similar study, but this is, it's a similar concept because it's looking at this idea of population vector. But all this study is saying right here, this is just talking about the idea that this is a study where there's a cue, and this cue tells the animal, you are going to be moving in some direction in the near future, some specific direction. But you're going to wait through a delay period until there's a go signal. And when the animal sees the go signal, that is when the animal actually performs the movement that it was told. So it's told to perform a specific direction of movement here. That's what these things are. Then it has to wait. And that's in this particular study, they're measuring motor cortex activity during this delay period or the waiting period. And then when they get here, that's when the animal actually performs the action. But what they're doing here is, this is the evidence that the motor cortex is involved with planning. They're looking at the activity of those neurons and motor cortex during the waiting phase. And what they find is that the population vector, adding up the activity of all of those different neurons with different preferred directions, the sum or the average of all of those activities or all of those neurons during the delay period predicts the actual direction of motion that the animal is going to perform in the near future. So what's important about this one? Yeah, what the animal does do here, this is when the animal actually performs the movement. It's actually being forecast or predicted by the motor cortex neurons. The motor cortex neurons are representing the direction of movement that the animal is about to perform before the animal actually does it. And it does so with a population vector. Once again, population vector can be thought of as basically the sum of activity of a bunch of different neurons, each of those neurons having its own preferred direction. Yeah, so that's actually all I want to do today. We'll start with talking about the cerebellum next time, and we'll finish the rest of these brain regions next time. So that's it. So we'll call it a day here. If anyone wants to stick around and chat, that is fine. Otherwise, I will see you next class, Tuesday.